Afternoon Talk on SAFM.
Well, my name is Ashraf Garda. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Another cracking 2 hours coming up. I can assure you we start later on. In fact, Shameen Rajbansi. Remember that name because she is the wife of the late Amichan Rajbansi, but more importantly now she's the new leader of the Minority Front. So we're going to put her in the spotlight and maybe get some interesting anecdotes that she can share with us, and maybe you can do so as well. So don't miss that after 3 o'clock. But for now, a very important issue. Once again, the world's leaders are converging on Davos in Switzerland, and we thought very appropriate we should ask this question: is there a viable alternative to capitalism and socialism? Is there a viable alternative to capitalism and socialism? But it's got to be viable. That's the focus. Economic, of course, is what we're talking about here. I'd love you to call in. That really is the big question. You can call in right away. In fact, 0891104207, 0891104207. Let's just get a sense of where you go with this one. If you want to add those comments, certainly put some points as well to that one. So a viable alternative. We have two guests to talk us through all of that. Lebogang Peku, policy analyst and executive director at the Trade Collective, which is an economic think tank. We'll be joined by her, as well as Leon Lowe, executive director at the Free Market Foundation. So just think about this one for a moment. It seems like pretty obvious for many people. There's just like two alternatives. There's capitalism and there's socialism, and not really never the twain shall meet, although some may suggest they do, but there's a sense from many people that in fact both don't really work. So if that's the case, then what indeed is the viable alternative? Do you have examples of that alternative? Talk about it. Did it happen in the past? And if so, why are we not using that right now? Why have things changed so much? So you've got the call-in number, you've got the SMS number. You can also tweet to me, and if you do that, cut me on the timeline, Ashraf Garda. Love it if you follow me and maybe just put in the hashtag the big question. So whatever it is, your comments, the big question, so that we can get a sense of where people are going with this issue here as well. Certainly would appreciate it. There's also some comments on my Facebook page, so you may want to join that Facebook page as well to allow you to comment too. Let's get on with the issues and get to my guests right away. Lebogang Peku, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us once again.
Thank you, Ashraf.
It's a pleasure. Leon Lowe, Executive Director at the Free Market Foundation. Good afternoon, Leon. Thanks for joining us too.
My pleasure too.
All right, I want to start with a quote which I think is very appropriate from Klaus Schwab, who is the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. And he says, and I quote, "Capitalism in its current form no longer fits the world around us. We have failed to learn the lessons from the financial crisis of 2009. A global transformation is urgently needed, and it must start with reinstating a global sense of social responsibility." So that's it's certainly got us thinking, is there an alternative? Let me start with you, Lebogang. What are your thoughts? Is there an alternative?
Well, I mean, I suppose so. People have been talking about the fact that capitalism is basically an economic system which is dedicated to production for profit and accumulation of value. And it's to do with the means of production and a really hierarchical organization of workplaces, workspaces, and of the way that we do what we do. And I mean, even though at the moment we talk about issues around socialism being in disarray and communism having failed, I think that we need to think about a critique of various forms of accumulation of wealth and use of labor. And the economic system has three things which it's supposed to do. It's really supposed to, number one, think about equity, fair and just outcomes. Think about issues around respect. Think about diversity of outcomes. The lies of capitalism in its purest, most vicious form is that there's meritocracy, that if you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you'll get to where you'll be, you too will be a Bill Gates. And obviously, people's bootstraps are not all the same length. So, we're pulling from different vantage points. And, I think that the arguments and the conversations which are now in force, speak more about participatory economics with new institutional arrangements, alternatives to private ownership of capital, social ownership of means of production, where they are either, a much more egalitarian means of ownership. And, things like various forms, and it's a plethora of critiques around it. Some instruments which are attempting to bring people on the periphery, historically on the periphery in this country, for example, into the mainstream of being catalysts in the economy. And those are some of the, I'm no praise singer for BEE, I must say, but I think that we need to think about the kind of which enable people to be participate.
We seem to have just lost Lebogang there. The line's really bad, and my apologies for that. Lebogang, we'll try and get you back on the line, hopefully on a better line in a moment. We are talking about an alternate economic system if we go with a line that capitalism and socialism, the two extremes, don't really give us what we want, which if you've heard Lebogang suggest that it certainly should give us economic freedom, it certainly should create wealth, but there must also be a sense that it cannot just be creating wealth for a minority, but needs to uplift society as a whole. Leon Lowe from the Free Market Foundation, what are your thoughts, firstly, on this issue?
Well, there are a couple of things to discuss. Firstly, I don't know in what sense anyone thinks capitalism has failed and needs to be replaced, or what anyone means by an alternative. There are really two options. You either leave people free, or you control them, or you have a mixture of the two. This idea that somebody is somehow going to come up with some new third alternative, you can't be polite about it. It's simply nonsense, and it's been going on for, hundreds of years. The capitalist option, let's define it quickly.
Mm-hmm.
If by that one means what's happening now, which is what Klaus Schwab has in mind, well, then let's be clear that that's not capitalism in the sense meant by people who propagate capitalism. Capitalism is, in fact, the alternative to what Klaus Schwab is upset about. What he's upset about is the fact that government interference on an unprecedented scale. Just bear in mind, governments have grown over the last 40 years from about a quarter of the economy of most countries to half of the economy of most countries. The number of controls and regulations has multiplied exponentially. In other words, what we have now is a system in which government interference and control and all the things, interestingly, Lebogang says she wants, is in fact what we've got. And that is what is causing the problem. So the alternative to what we have is in fact capitalism, or the word we prefer to use, free market. In other words, stop the government intervention, stop the government controls that, for example, forced banks to pour trillions of dollars into what are called toxic mortgages. In other words, mortgages everyone knows in advance won't be paid. That have caused the current financial subprime crisis. So that it's a direct, and we must understand this very clearly, it is not just a consequence of government policy, it was government policy. The government wanted, directed, and forced the crisis on the world by creating Freddie, Fannie, and other what are called government-sponsored enterprises, what we call Aristotles, in order to pour money into what are called subprime, we would call not creditworthy mortgages, and then sell these with government backing, government security, which is obviously not the free market or not capitalism, it's socialism, to international banks until the government could no longer back them up, that's the American government, and then the system collapsed, the bubble burst, which is what free market people have warned about, said would happen, predicted would happen, and predict will happen again. If we get more of this, more and more and more government control, more and more government distortion, bigger and bigger and bigger governments, we will have less and less growth, more and more poverty, and more and bigger crises. The next crisis will simply
are you
just be bigger.
suggesting, because we may just go back to definitions in a second, but are you suggesting, let's look at the scenario of the USA and maybe to a large degree Europe, are you suggesting that their economic woes is directly related to the fact that there's government interference in the economic systems?
Yes, it is. I mean, I don't know, anybody can not know that. It should be obvious, because these are parastatals, Freddie, Fannie, Ginny, and there are 13 of them, set up for one purpose and one purpose. Their sole function was to create subprime, or what are now called toxic mortgages, and then to package these into what are called derivatives, credit default swaps and things. Doesn't matter at the time being what they are, although I can explain if anyone wants. which were then sold with government backing, government underwriting. You must understand this had nothing to do with the market, nothing to do with capitalism. This was exclusively, solely, and deliberately American government policy, and in America the government has grown in the last 40 years from a quarter of the economy to half the economy. Now, if you want to call that capitalism, fine, let's just find a word to make sure we understand what we're talking about. You cannot call it a free market. If you want to call it capitalism, it's a strange use of the word, but nonetheless, the alternative to the mess we're in is in fact capitalism, namely leave things to the market, which, by the way, is not leaving things to the rich or not leaving things to the meritocracy. It's leaving things to ordinary people. Liberate ordinary people to do what they want.
Okay, and the question then
Stop
is how
directing and regulating them.
The question then is exactly how do they in fact do what they want. Don't answer that for the moment. We'll get to that in just a second. Let me just remind you, the big question we're asking at 2 o'clock: is there an alternative, a viable alternative to capitalism and socialism? We're talking economics here in the light of the economic woes around the country, around the world, that is. 0891104207, 0891104207. I have two guests, Leon Lowe, who is the Executive Director at the Free Market Foundation. We also have Lebogang Peku, who is a policy analyst and Executive Director at the Trade Collective, which is an economic think tank. And, of course, I have you as well. Your call's most welcome. My name's Ashraf Garda. Thanks for joining us, indeed, on the afternoon talk show. We do this weekdays from 2 to 4. Lebogang, we do have you back on the line, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, hopefully on a better line this time. I'm going to get to the other callers in a second, but I want you to respond to the point that Leon Lowe has made, that in fact we need to move more towards capitalism if we want to get to the desires, the economic desires that we want to set out for ourselves. That in fact those that think of capitalism currently as one of the woes have got it all wrong. Your thoughts on it?
Look, I mean, I think that most economies and most countries have some kind of a hybrid of social, developmental, and capitalist intent. And I think that one of the problems that of that analysis is that, capitalism and the free market analysis assumes that the market in and of itself is perfect and is value-free, and it's not. It is also a series of choices. Many of those choices are fallible. We've seen what that has done at Wall Street and the meltdown that the rest of the world, America's meltdown that the rest of the world had to be hostage to, and the knock-on effect of a series of choices. So the market is not a king. It's not some inviolable, sacrosanct space. It is a space made up of people like you and me making choices, and some of them unregulated choices, some of them indulging in cowboy behavior, wild speculation, distorting currency prices, distorting commodity prices and market value, and of course distorting mortgage value. So I think that it's a bit of a misnomer, and I'd beg to differ quite strongly with that. And I'd also say that the thing with leaving things to the market is that it also presumes that the market necessarily corrects itself automatically. We have seen over the past 3 to 4 years that it does not. The Greek market is not correcting itself. The Italian market is not correcting itself. They need to be bailed out. They need state intervention. We still need government intervention and government regulation. And we also shouldn't also assume, one of the arguments that your neoliberal or your free market proponents will use is that the government should not run the economy because it's inherently, susceptible to corruption. Of course, the private sector and corporates are susceptible to huge amounts of corruption. Most of us will remember Enron and various other scandals over the last 10 to 15 years, and Danone and quite a number of others. So that also is not true, because who is the market? The market is still us, and it is still people who need to be regulated.
Okay, I'm sure the listeners have lots to say about it. I'd like to get to your calls. I'll run through 3-4 calls in one go, and then we'll get a response. So Charles, Sig, Bruce, and the rest stay on the line. Mabule, we're going to start with you in Polokwane. Hi, welcome to the show.
Hi. I think we all agree that the 2008 recession, which is still continuing now, really requires us to look at an alternative view. And I don't think that alternative would be very far from capitalism itself. So I wouldn't necessarily go for either socialism or communism, but I'd say maybe, there's a new terminology coming from the experience in China on the state capitalism, to say maybe the states may need to intervene, because the markets have clearly shown that when left alone, they will cripple at some stage. So there need to be more regulation on the state. I think the developmental role that many of the states in the east of Asia are taking are really paying now. And I mean, as per the projections, China would be the biggest economy in the next few years or so. So I think that's where we need to look into a more active role by the state, but also ensuring that obviously we don't move into capitalism, to communism, because that has failed in history as we know it.
Okay, as you can see, contrasting, conflicting opinions. Indeed, thanks for that, Mabule. Let's get to further calls. Charles in Mtata. Hi.
Good day, Ashraf and your guest.
Thank you.
My take is, Ashraf, look here, in the early centuries, we had the dinar system in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of the world, the dinar system is still being used and it's trying to be revitalized. The other concept is
what does that mean, the dinar system? Tell us more about it.
It's a gold coin system that was practiced in Mali, in Africa. Those times, in the sense that transactions is done with currency that is got value in itself. Not like the dollar and the euro that is paper money that, the value is artificially, created. So you have a hard currency in your hands to do transactions with. The alternative also with the gold. I mean, now that India was going to buy oil from Iran with gold. So that is an alternative, but it needs to be phased in. It's a concept that people will say, no, but that is, it will destroy the economy of the world. But I think it works, and I need to think out of the box to make a new system, create a new system other than what we've got. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that, Charles. Again, thought-provoking. Dinar, the gold standard system, maybe. Just a thought, is there a country, in your opinion, that you think where they've got the economic system working just right? It's absolutely perfect. In your opinion, you let me know. Sig in Randburg, hi. Okay, we got you on the hi.
And to your guests as well, Ashraf. Nothing conceivably could be worse than the oppression of communism, which violates all freedom and which violates freedom of thought, expression, the press, of everything, and our guys are advocating it in this country. It's disgraceful that they should still be doing so. But the other freedom that communism violates is the freedom to compete fairly on merit, not on race. Like we are wanting to be doing now, and I do think that capitalism is a dirty word, yes, because it's come to stand for unfettered exploitation of people and resources and of the environment. That's what capitalism is.
So where is it working for you, Sig? Sig, your opinion? I mean, is there a country where it's working for you based upon what you think?
Capitalism, even if it's an unfettered exploitation of everything, it's still preferable to the depravity of communism, which has been destroyed and which had to give up its reign in all countries, including Cuba. But our idiots are advocating it, and I do hope that Lebogang, who is otherwise a very intelligent person, does not advocate it just because she thinks that blacks have got to steal back what she thinks was stolen when it was largely not stolen at all.
Okay, Sig, thanks for that. I'm not sure what you mean by our idiots, who you're referring to, but I'm sure that will come through. Bruce in PE, hi.
Yes, thanks to you and your guest. Ashraf, I just want to thank you for last when I'm listening to this type of debate. You've actually got people in the studio that know what they're talking about.
Good, I'm glad.
When it comes to the criticism of capitalism, even Zig, I think, has fallen foul of the myth and lie that's been spread that capitalism is responsible for all the evils of the world today. And I think the reality is that, as Leon would point out to you, that the capitalism, for every bad story of a capitalism that has exploited workers, you could just as equally show many success stories where that is not the case, and people have been enriched and satisfactory to the satisfaction of everyone around them. So, in a nutshell, what I'm saying is, this is such an important debate. I'm so tired of hearing the lies and myths spread by ignorant people on the station, and including lies and myths that are spread, I think, through ignorance of many of the people like yourself that host these shows that are not sufficiently versed in what capitalism really means. I think when we started off the show, the basic premise of what capitalism stands for by definition is largely misunderstood. But you've got policymakers that don't understand the concept, what it means for, touting all kinds of alternatives when there aren't realistically any.
Well, I mean, the good thing about it, and this is why we're having this show, and we're asking these type of questions, which is certainly to get people thinking. Now, if in asking the questions, we find that even the premise of what exactly capitalism or socialism may well be maybe incorrect, that's also fine, because it certainly allows the experts to correct
what
that.
I'm saying is, I've heard this debate for many, many years without clarifying the basics, like on many other subject matters. And I think this radio station, which is so important to us, must raise the bar in terms of the understanding and knowledge of the people that host it, that can differentiate between lies and rubbish, that we get onto the concrete, substantive issues without spending years and years, like I have done, listening to the station, hearing these lies and myths perpetuated.
Okay,
so
point taken, Bruce. Let's move on.
What you do, and
Yes.
I know you'll take it in context of what I mean.
Let's move on, because I think
Great.
point taken.
Thanks,
But let's wait. You haven't answered the one question I'm asking you, Bruce. You're gone. I wanted to ask Bruce a whole lot of things about where he thinks it's working perfectly. Let's just get to my two guests again. I'll get to the other callers in a moment. Leon Lowe, you may want to respond to some of the callers. And at some stage, we probably need to redefine that whole issue of capitalism.
I hope I've got everyone's name right, because also I'm hearing a bad line.
Yes.
I think made a very important point about, for example, what's happened in China, and I think he might have mentioned India, but he could have in the same context. And it's very important to understand this, is what the Chinese government has done is kept a communist political system and introduced actually the world's most radical capitalist system that there is. It's the purest form of capitalism that there is in the world at the moment, is in what are called China's special economic zones, and that's where virtually all of the
Okay, explain what do you mean by that, the purest capitalist system?
Okay, that is to say the purest free market. So, for example, there is simply no government, virtually no government regulation of banking or finance or exchange control. For example, in these special economic zones, which is where the Chinese economic story is happening, they don't even keep records. There's no central bank. You don't even know what the balance of payments is, just as we don't know what it is between Free State and Gauteng. There is just complete laissez-faire. People can employ, hire and fire, start businesses, travel in and out. There's no regulation to speak of who may go and work there. Companies bring in personnel as they choose and skills and take money out and profit out as they choose. They don't need to apply for exchange control clearance or don't even actually have to fill in forms, so that nobody even knows how much money is going in and out. What we do know is that there is a fantastically rapid creation of wealth taking place. Conversely, in the so-called capitalist West, you have had a massive decline in capitalism, and by capitalism I mean a market free of government regulation. So let's just get terminology.
Okay.
If by capitalism people mean countries in which government has played an increasingly big role, well, then we just, that's fine, I don't mind. I'm not here to purify the English language, I'm here to talk economics. And so let's talk about whether the market is free or not free. And in India and China, where they have taken far-reaching steps to go from the world's most regulated, unfree, least capitalist economies to the world's most free, most capitalist economies, we see the economic miracle. Now, in Africa, there's very, very good news. The country in the world that has made the biggest shift from socialism to capitalism is Ghana. Of any country in the world. It's gone from one of the least free to the most free economies and is now experiencing 10-12% growth, growing even faster than China and India. Another African example is Mauritius. And in fact, sub-Saharan, or what used to be called Black Africa, is now the highest growth region in the world. It is booming because African countries are moving towards capitalism, whilst so-called capitalist countries are moving very rapidly away from capitalism.
Okay, Leon, we're
to the
coming
point
to...
where over half the economy is now run by the government.
Is that sustainable? These successes that you talk
capitalism,
about?
by the way, has not failed. The capitalist countries still are the richest, most successful countries in the world by a very, very big margin. They're still the countries into which the poor people of the world flee and often lose their lives. They're so desperate to get there. So, firstly, they have not failed. They still are by far the world's countries, and therefore it's sustainable. It's the only system that is sustainable. Everything else, all the alternatives have been shown not to be sustainable.
Okay, lots more to come as we ask the big question. Alternatives, if any, to capitalism and socialism, and I think the key really... The other word coming out of it.
I didn't respond just very
Okay,
quickly.
I'm going to give you a chance in a moment because we're on to news time right now. So I'll certainly
I don't want to be rude.
No, that's fine. I'm going to get back to you and Lebogang just in a second. So we're talking about economic systems, and as we know, they certainly have an impact on you. You can ignore many things in your life. You certainly can't ignore economic systems, because they certainly impact on you in a big way. Two guests to talk about it. Lebogang Peku, was a policy analyst and executive director at the Trade Collective, and also you've heard the voice of Leon Lowe, executive director at the Free Market Foundation. I'll get to some of the other callers as well. We're talking about this all in the light of the meetings once again in Davos in Switzerland, where lots of issues being discussed, including global meltdown, the recessions that started a couple of years back, and the fact that we may well be set for another one. We're asking questions: what is the world doing right or wrong, and what needs to be changed economically in terms of policy? So hopefully we can all prosper and avoid some of the problems we've had right now. All right, I'm going to go very quickly first to Leon Lowe once again, just to complete what you were saying before the news headlines.
Yeah, sorry to the other callers. I wanted to do with respect to them. Charles raised the issue of the dinar, the gold standard. Yes, we need to understand that capitalism in its original form also had money issued by the market, by private people, and people decided for themselves what they would like to use as money. We now have legal tender laws where the government makes the money. People assume that is necessarily a good thing, but there's no reason why we should have a central bank, and why the market, which provided money, by the way, which for 100 years there was no inflation. As soon as the government started producing the money, of course, we had inflation because they just produced too much. And so he's quite right about that. Then the third caller, and the fourth caller, whose name I didn't get, the third caller pointed out that communism is not just an issue about economics. In fact, it was interesting that he pointed out all he was really talking about was freedom, liberty, private rights. And that's also important to understand, that governments don't control the economy. Governments control people. So whenever you don't like a free market, you must understand what you're saying is you don't like freedom. You don't like people controlling their own lives. And so he was right. And then the fourth person spoke about lies and myths. I think he may be a bit harsh, whilst I agree with some of what he was saying. I think that the common wisdom around the world is now very, very confusing to people. And what you are doing on this program, and what you do is to try to add clarity where there's confusion. And the confusion is that these words have lost their meaning. People are very confused. There's a lot of disinformation around, but I don't think the blame is in any extent with us here in South Africa. There's global confusion, and we need to understand that the freer economies in the world are the economies that are wealthier, have more personal liberty, freer press, free association of workers, free trade unions, and more importantly, they're the countries into which poor people want to go from the socialist countries. People do not flee from America to Cuba. They flee from Cuba to America. Fleeing is always in one direction, from socialist to capitalist countries, and the people who do the fleeing are the poorest of the poor. In other words, the people socialists say they care for, but in fact they're the people who can't wait to get out.
All right, let's bring in, I'll get to the other callers in a moment. Lebogang Peku once again. Now, clearly, you've made a few comments early on. Leon Lowe has given his views. Certainly some of those views between the two of you are in conflict. Which ones would you like to challenge?
Well, I think there was a point that was made by one of the callers. My apologies, I didn't note all of their names, which said that communism must not come back because it comes back with repression and with a lack of freedom, which is a point that Leon is also making. But that point was also deeply racialized, the implication that particularly in this country that communism is to do with unmerited entitlements and access to unmerited entitlements. And I think that communism, in fact, in its day was intended to be a much more egalitarian form of life and economy, which was supposed to transcend race, in fact, and thought that class was the fundamental issue. There are lots of concerns and arguments against particularly the former Soviet model. But I do think that we should not presume particularly that the free market brings freedom for all people. It doesn't necessarily, in all of the countries and all of the case studies that Leon and a few other people along those lines have cited, we also see a widening wage gap. And although Ghana is being cited very, very clearly and quite profusely as a success story and as a wonder child, social inequality is growing. Social inequality has grown in Russia, in Ukraine, and in the former Soviet republics in the last 20 years. And that's to do with the adjustment costs of moving radically from one economic system to another. And that in and of itself is not a failure on either part, but it does indicate that there is always a propensity for certain people to fall within the cracks. And this is a thing that the free market model has not necessarily and has not sufficiently taken cognizance of. And I go back to my previous comments about how, it presumes that everybody should just pull themselves by the bootstraps and that everybody will be free. Free for what and free for whom? And I think that there's also the notion that the greater the amount of freedom, the greater the opportunity to self-actualize. I don't think that the capitalist system in its purest sense actually gives people the opportunity to self-actualize, because it does, of its very nature, thrive on the notion of survival of the fittest. You snooze, you lose. And, if I'm the biggest in the playground, I'm the one who's going to gain the biggest benefits, to put it very crudely and very simply. So you have the United States, which has not only used capitalism as an economic model, but it's also a lifestyle model. I think that I agree there with Leon that it's about people's private lives. It's about actually a way of thinking. It's about managing and processing things that we aspire to, and also creating false value and false aspirations. In order to then buttress and subsidize those false values and false aspirations, there is also a lot of false value, false benefication on costs, on shares, on hedge funds, etc. That takes place in order to then keep shareholders happy, to purport that there is a profit, even though that profit may be less than is being advertised, etc., etc. Tampering with company profits, that sort of thing. And I think that this becomes a vicious cycle. Socialism in its form has also become discredited. What used to be the Labour Party 20 or 30 years ago, before Margaret Thatcher basically chopped it at the knees, is not the Labour Party of Tony Blair by any stretch of the imagination, and it's certainly not the Labour Party that we see today. Socialism across the globe has been discredited, and I think that is because the times have changed. The kind of 50 years ago on the African continent, there was a move towards the Socialist Republic of Africa. These are the kind of discourses that were taking place. They have been overtaken by social events, by political events, and by the economic environment. We need to find a place which is still compassionate and which is still managing to create businesses which thrive and which still also has a semblance, at least, of social egalitarianism, and which is concerned that the weakest people are not marginalized even further.
Okay, now do we have that place, Lebogang? And while you answer that, maybe answer a previous question brought up by others, and also spoken about by Leon as well, that there's been this misinformation or disinformation, and it's been imported so that we now listen to phrases, listen to trends, and we all sort of cotton onto those things and we don't really fully understand them. Your thoughts on that? If capitalism or the free market has been given a bad name or bad press to a stage, can we say the same about socialism as well? I think you've sort of alluded to that too. Just maybe answer that in one go, then I'll get to some of the callers too.
Yes, I think both. I think certainly socialism has been given a bit of a bad rap. Socialism was, especially in places across the African continent in particular, which I can speak with some authority, was certainly was overtaken by structural adjustment, which is a neoliberal intervention, which of course spoke to the need to devalue currencies, to disinvest in social spending, to become basically less compassionate, to disable people from self-actualizing by having access to free or subsidized education, access to free or subsidized healthcare, access to free or subsidized social amenities, and understanding that we're not all, our bootstraps are not all the same length. So I think that in a strange sort of way, although some people might say that we need to move close to capitalism, capitalism did a lot of damage to socialism in that particular context.
All right, we have, just to move on to something very different, after 3. In the spotlight today is Shamin Thakur Rajbansi. She's the wife of the late Amichan Rajbansi, and now she's the new leader of the Minority Front. So we put her in the spotlight, find out exactly what makes her tick. Don't miss that one there. But for now, the big question we're asking, are there alternatives? Is there a successful alternative to capitalism and socialism? As you've heard, even now from our 2 guests, esteemed guests, they clearly have very, very poles apart views on key issues here. And if they may have differing views, can you imagine how then can the collective, the masses, tend to sort of have a policy that they would tend to agree with if they're following a certain person's views? No wonder the confusion. 0891 104 207. Okay, let's get to a few of the callers then. George, we're going to go to you in Durban. Hi, George.
Hi, good afternoon, Ashraf.
Good afternoon.
And good afternoon to Mrs. Rajbansi.
Oh, she's coming up later on. There's still a while for that, after 3.
Okay. Ashraf, what I know is that socialism and capitalism, to a certain extent, needs to coexist for any country to survive. One philosophy cannot do without the other, only not the other overpowering the other. If you remember, with the National Party government, the things they used to do, they nationalized railways, telecom, post office, you name it, so in order to preserve jobs for people. So that's where the government is required to come in, where the major employment for people is, the government has power to grasp, if you get what I mean.
Okay.
And then, on the other hand, the thing with socialism or communism is that they come up with very good concepts and very good words that sounds very melodious to the public. But when it comes, and for that they gain a lot of support. And when they gain that support, once they are in power, when they realize that what they were preaching is not real in real life, they begin to impose and become dictators. So that's why you see most of the communist countries are ruled by dictators, because they know that they can't keep the promises that they make to the people when they are not in power, if you get my point.
Okay, interesting point brought up there. Thanks for that, George. Let's move on to Mike in Middleburg. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Ashraf, and thank you very much for taking my call.
It's a pleasure. Go for it.
Yes, you see, Ashraf, to start with, perhaps I should make reference to 2 very important songs, which at some stage you must play.
Okay, but you need to move on. You need to move on quickly, Mike. Yeah, Peter Tosh songs,
yes,
maybe.
I will. A song titled "The Day the Dollar Died" by the late great Peter Tosh. It has all the answers. The second one is "Done with Bonaparte" by Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits. It tells you how capitalism graduates into imperialism. But now, because of time, Ashraf, let me say we acknowledge and agree that capitalism is a social order, actualization of Satanism, where profits regulate financial life and social order. It is an economic genocide which accounts for each and every evil thing you can think of.
Why do you call it economic genocide? What are the facts for you, Mike?
You just look at the criminal salaries. I have made repeatedly examples. You know Julian Roberts, the CEO of Old Mutual, takes home 29.9 million rand per annum. Graham McKay of SAB takes home 31.8 million rand per annum. Now you check the lowest paid workers where these people are CEOs. And then it tells you, the wage gap that is there.
Okay, but shouldn't it be that he earns that much because of his ability to create? He earns that much because of his ability to create wealth, far greater than what he himself earns. Isn't that the incentive?
No, Ashraf. You see, as they earn these criminal salaries, they do so at the expense of the downtrodden. The wage gap grows further and further. But what is most important, and I think many people are not aware, capitalism is an evil system. It is an evil spirit. It is the reason why we have the word sin.
Okay, Mike, I'm going to move on. Mike, I'm going to move on very quickly. What's your solution, quickly, in 30 seconds?
Let us have an indaba and engage South Africans on this matter.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Mike wants an indaba. Okay, I'll take two more quick calls. MK in Ilovo, you're on the air. Hi.
Hi, how are you, man?
I'm good, MK. What's your point?
I think I've got only 2 points to make. One, I think it's important for us to realize that you can never define capitalism. It takes certain forms in certain countries. And therefore, to define it in certain ways, it will be injustice. Let me give you a typical example. South Africa now, we talk of a mixed market system that we have. And if you look at the make of the market structure of South Africa today, I call it a monopolic system, or probably a cartel system, where the industries are highly concentrated. I'll give you an example. If you look at telecom companies in this country, you look at the banks in this country, you look at the construction companies in this country, you will find that there's only 3, 4, 5 players. And indeed, then what happens is even if the economy grows by 5, 6, 7%, those people will then take all the cream and leave the crumbs to the majority. And therefore, it is important for us then to recognize that capitalism in its form, the way it's practiced in the world now, has damaged how we do things. It is now a casino economy that is emancipated in the United States, it's emancipated in Europe. And therefore, it's important for us then to have a solution, which is a solution that I want to get to now, is that indeed we need government to intervene at a certain point to ensure that those who own capital don't exploit the countries that they are involved in. And there's evidence, as research now, that people who do not regulate capitalism, they find themselves in big water. That's why the world is in trouble now. And it's important for us to underline this in the South African context. In the South African context, we find ourselves that the economy since 1994 has grown on average 4%. But since 1994, this economy has managed to create almost 0 jobs. Why? Is because the cream of what the economy has grown to went to those big players, and they've never very
Okay, and MK, your solution very quickly?
The solution that I want to put forward is that we need to then look at socialism, we need to then look at capitalism, and then we need to marry the two to fill the gap that exists in our country. That's very important.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks for that, MK. That's a point that's been said by many people. Sort of get to capitalism, get socialism, divide by 2, and you get your answers. I don't think it's a point that Leon Lowe agrees with. I'm going to get to Leon in a second. There's a T-man who says it's from Italy. Now, does it mean you're listening online from Italy, or are you Italian? Because your name doesn't end in a vowel. That's just my gross generalization. Hi, T-man. Hi, T-man.
Yes,
hi. Yes.
How are you?
I'm good. Are you calling?
I'm a South African living in Italy.
All right, because I thought, well, there's no vowel at the end, so you can't be Italian. Just checking.
No. I think we should stop being very confused as a country. An average person is very, very greedy. An average country is very, very greedy. An average country wants to teach other countries. You saw during the World Cup, Australia wanted to take the whole World Cup away from South Africa. England wanted to take the whole World Cup away from South Africa. Let's stop faking this thing. The world is greedy out there. It's a dog-eat-dog, and it's the survival of the fittest.
Okay, but is that necessarily a bad thing?
As South Africans, we should go out there and not be confused, because when there's a war out there of the survival of the fittest, and we're still debating what the war is all about, we don't live in an island. It's a world out there where it's a survival of the fittest. You saw from the World Cup, you even saw from our Porta and Grappa, the World Trade Organization wanted to take the word away from us. We have to go out there and fight for our country and defend our country so that we can have zero unemployment in our country. Let's not be confused. Socialism is not an answer. Let's go out there and fight for our country.
All right, there you are, said by T-Man from Italy. Right, Leon Lowe is still with us, as well as Lebogang Peko. Leon, just your thoughts on that. That's come through from many people, and I know that people have different views on this one. The sense that capitalism and the free market that you talk about as well, in effect, has no real conscience, doesn't have a soul.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Freedom doesn't have a conscience. In other words, what we mean by freedom, any freedom, I'm not just talking economics here, means choosing your own values. You see, that's what it is, your own religion, your own sexual preferences, your own relationships, your own career, whatever. That's what freedom is. The system doesn't have values. People have values. People are compassionate. People are caring. People have welfare, and so on. So they're absolutely right. Capitalism doesn't propagate self-interest or profit or anything. It simply says let everyone make up their own mind about their own values, their own behavior, their own so on. Now, there's a few things we have to... This issue of the income gap keeps being raised,
right,
and
yeah.
I understand that, the question of equality. But the thing that's very difficult to bear in mind when we think about equality is that people who say they worry about the poor actually never talk about the poor. They talk about the rich. They're obsessed with how much money rich people earn. The fact is that under capitalism, poor people earn more than poor people earn under socialism, which is why poor people always want to live under capitalism. They always move to capitalist countries. A poor person, the person I'm looking at through my window doing the gardening over here, he's not interested in how much Harry Oppenheimer or Bill Gates or somebody earns. He's interested in how much he earns. And he earns more here than he would, for example, in Zimbabwe, or he earns more in Ghana than he would in Sierra Leone, and more in China than he would in Indonesia, for example. So the poor, if you're worried about the poor, you should really ignore the rich. Stop thinking about how much the rich get or even how much the gap is. Concern yourself with one thing and one thing only. Are the poor better off? Are their living standards rising? Where do their living standards rise the fastest? Where do they want to live? Where do they have most housing, most literacy, most healthcare, and so on? And the answer to that is very, very simply in capitalist countries. And then, Lebogang, I'd like to just raise an issue with you, and I must say that I think this has been a very fruitful discussion. But one small thing, you mentioned the Greek, Italian, Spanish, and other financial crises. I just want to point out something very important here. Their problem is sovereign debt. Their problem is that their governments are insolvent. And we need to understand, if you want to call that capitalism, well, that's why we call ourselves the free market.
Okay.
It's the governments of those countries that have messed up. It's the governments of those countries that are insolvent. It's the governments of the countries in which you have the most government intervention, the highest taxes, the biggest governments, and in the countries where you have less of it, like, for example, Switzerland or Ghana or Mauritius or Taiwan or North South Korea or whatever, these countries are stable. In fact, they have continued growing, and the countries that have reduced the role of government in the economy have grown. The countries with the crisis are the ones where the role of government simply got too big and governments messed up and stifled the economy.
Okay, I'm sure Lebogang wants to respond to that.
No, interesting point. I think that one of the things that's quite interesting as well about the movement of people from one region to the next. Typically, the movement of the huge influx of immigrants from South America to North America, from many African countries to the north, is to do with the lack of a skills base which is sufficient to accommodate the skills and the needs of people here. And that's to do with the kind of rescission on social expenditure that we have seen over the last generation or two, which seems to have driven people away from their countries of origin, and where many of them, I think, would prefer to invest their skills, their time, their talents, and their lives. And I think that it's an interesting quandary, because what we see is particular countries being discredited, or particular systems failing, and then being forced, and usually because of the imposition of some of the free market prescripts of institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, on African countries, whereby, university lecturers, their salaries are slashed in half in Zambia. So, what are you going to do if you are a science professor at the University of Zambia? Your salary is slashed to, a few thousand kwacha a month. Harvard is calling you. University of London is calling you. You go. And I think that, in a strange sort of way, again, that is one of the things, that is one of the dilemmas and the contradictions. I also think that it's interesting, again, what Leon is saying about ignore the rich and focus on the poor. I absolutely agree. I also think that, however, in focusing on the poor, we do need to think about what kind of value system that we are going to have as a people, as a nation. I think that, it's well and good to say that freedom has no conscience and that we create our own values. However, all of our freedoms must come with a sense of responsibility. So my argument with the SEZs and the IDZs as well is that you then have a situation where people are hired and fired at whim, where quality control is very limited, where there is union busting, where there are no tax records that are kept, there's no paperwork, there are enclaves of their own self-governing autonomy within countries. And within that autonomy, there's incredible abuse of people. And can we really say that those people who are being fired and hired at whim, living in very difficult conditions, is that the kind of value system that we want to replicate? And the thing with capitalism as we know it is that it thrives on surplus labor, which means that there must be more people. There are actually now more people for all the work that needs to be done in the world. So that means there'll always be an unending pool, a ceaseless pool of cheap and willing and desperate labor, which is going to subsidize this very system. Can we really say then that those people are there because it's their choice, they are free to be exploited? And I think that those are sort of the dilemmas that I have in terms of the consciousness and the kind of value system that we are going to develop as a people, as a globe, as a planet. It goes back to survival of the fittest. You snooze, you lose. You're born poor, you stay poor. Be grateful that you have a job, as exploitative as it may be. So there's the guy who's earning 20 million a year. He was just born white, right, cleverer than you, faster than you, tough luck. Are you ever going to aspire to that? And I think that we need to think about a medium ground where your hope is not necessarily it's not fruitless to imagine that a street cleaner can aspire to more than that, can aspire to more than just surviving.
All right, let's just, I'm going to read a couple of very quick SMSs, then get to Mutala and Anwar and make them pretty short and get my guests to wrap up because we're on to 3 o'clock, just about almost, in fact. Someone saying, surely economies are messed up by a few fraudulent humans. Ashraf, let's just divide our country into two halves, one state for us capitalists and the other for those socialists. How can South Africa have a free market capitalism if China, Europe and America subsidizes products in a competition to our unsubsidized businesses? That comes from Lindell. And another saying, what he's talking about is not capitalism, but rather liberalism. And there's just some more that I don't want to go through all of that. It's just going to take far too long. And Molefe is saying free market equals self-interest, which results in corruption and exploitation. So there you are. Incredible cross-section of opinions anyway. Right, Motala, I'm going to get to you and Anwar. Just make it short and sharp for about 30 seconds each. I certainly would appreciate that. Hi, Motala.
Neither capitalism nor socialism is inherently bad. It is the people who, especially the rich and the powerful, deliberately using these methods to exploit other people, particularly the poor. In fact, if you take the prophets themselves, criticize such people, charging excessive interest to poor people, as the banks are doing in the capitalist
Okay,
system.
quick one. What's your solution? Very quickly.
We should follow the solution laid down by Islam, what the Prophet said, that you use both methods, but don't exploit the poor and then be fair in your trade with others. If you do all that, then you can use. Prophet even nationalized the most crucial raw material, the waters of the desert. He bought it off and gave it free to the people. He did all that. Both capitalism and communism he followed. But he ensured that none of the people who are exploit, particularly the poor.
Okay. Mutala, got that. Thanks so much. Anwar, I'm going to give you like 15 seconds to make your point. Hi.
No. Thanks,
Anwar,
Ashraf.
yes.
Just to differ with the gentleman who was praising capitalism. If capitalism was so wonderful, why were Europeans moving out of Europe 400 or 300 years ago and settling in our socialist countries? South Africa, for example, was a rich country. I come from the Cape here. My forefathers was a wealthy nation, the Khoisan people. And there was a movement from capitalist countries into our
socialist
Okay,
society.
Anwar, you've made your point.
Also,
I want to.
why is
Anwar, you've made your
capitalism
point.
not implemented in America?
Okay, Anwar, you've made your point. I'm on to news time. My apologies for that. Leon Law, I'm going to give you the last words in 20 seconds to wrap up.
Yes, there's been a lot that's said, and I just want to point out that the more capitalist countries don't have people that are unemployed. They have full employment, like Mauritius, Hong Kong, Taiwan, increasingly Ghana, China, India. And also, the person who said, who was speaking about Islam was absolutely right. Islam is 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 absolutely right.